welcome to this afternoon's live. Started a couple of minutes early as Jake was in the room. A number of you have been watching the Spitfire movie and enjoying that. So without further ado, let me introduce the legendary Jake Jackson. Hang on, I'm hearing myself come back. Just give me 1 second. There we go. That's better. Great. Okay, cool. So, yes, the legendary, that way. There you are. The legendary Jake Jackson. How are you, Jake?
Hi, Guy. I'm all right. Thanks very much.
Good.
I'm like the rest of us, stuck at home. But I have this little Hyper One mixing studio at home, which you can see the surround speakers of, and it's my it keeps me out of trouble and keeps me busy, and it's without it I'd be a bit bored.
I know. I like the nice shed, which people are now sort of almost as familiar with as I am. But I mean, if we didn't have this, we'd be so stymied, wouldn't we? I know. How has this? How has all this affected you? Are you able to keep working at home?
I've got some mixing to do, which is great. Obviously, Spitfire had their big launch at the end of last week, so I've been doing a bit of stuff for that. So that's been keeping me a little bit busy. I've had a musical that we were halfway through recording. I had to get stymied, unfortunately, but or paused, should we say? And but I could mix half of that. I could mix all the orchestra, that was all recorded, and half of the voices. Yeah. So we're going to go back. We're going to start looking at going back in the studio maybe next week to record vocalists one at a time to finish that off. We've done the choir. We've done the big stuff. It was just a vocalist. So that's ticking along. I've got a couple of like small album projects for people, and I've just finished a ridiculously silly advert that's will be on at the weekend. That's not dissimilar to the Paul's piece, but
okay.
It involved at the end. It involves 120 children singing.
Oh, so, right. But look, how is all this social distancing going to work with orchestras at air?
That's yet to be decided, of course, and that's the one thing that obviously has stopped is any recording, which is really tricky because it's like that's the thing I really miss doing. But but that's that. Just before the lockdown, we were literally the weekend before we were going to do an orchestra at Abbey Road for a game, and I'd done a layout with all the orchestra 2 meters apart from each other, including the strings, and it looked quite nice. I was really interested to see how it's going to sound. I'd love to have done it just before that, so I could have gone into lockdown and thought about how it might be. But I think the trickiness is not necessarily the musicians' social distancing, so I think that will just about work because most musicians are about 2 meters apart from each other. But it's things like breaks can't be 15 minutes because everyone can't go to the bathroom and get a cup of tea and stand in the queue. So things like that are going to be the real issue, and getting in and out of the building. And I think like having a one-way system into the studio, so you go in one way and out the other. Things like that. That's what they're talking about. So I think that's going to be the hardest thing. And
it's going to be.
Fingers crossed it doesn't last too long.
No, I know. I mean because we're all desperate. It's what we love doing, isn't it? And it's just so hard. I can't imagine how that's going to work out. There's loads of people are joining us, as you can see. We've got people from Memphis, we've got France, Las Vegas, Salt Lake City, Melbourne, Florida, Romania, Arizona, sunny Wales. I think that's a contradiction in terms, but let's pass by that one. Let's pass by that.
I've been to Wales when it's sunny.
Now, this is a week of enormous news for Spitfire. I mean, the whole. Oh my goodness, the core thing and the Discover thing is just incredible. How long has that been in the works? Was that sort of planned from the off?
Yeah, it was planned from the off, and that was the thing I was most excited about when we were recording was that. And so it's been very difficult to hold on to the kind of the excitement of what this can mean for particularly education, I think, around the world. That's what I'm most excited about. That's what I really enjoyed putting my head towards when I was recording it and mixing it. It was like how important those. I didn't realise quite how important the mixes were going to be and what they were going to use for core, but that's turned out to be great. But just the whole recording process of it, and I've notated that, so hopefully I can do some masterclasses on how I recorded it, and then we can use that for education as well. So it opens up such a massive thing, and that's what the BBC can bring on board as well, because obviously for those that don't know the BBC that well, it's an amazing because it goes, the whole country has access to it, and particularly now they're doing lessons and stuff like that, online lessons, and to have an orchestra of that caliber, and the way we did it, it's fantastic, and to be able to give it to people for little money if they can afford it, or no money if they can't, is an amazing.
I know. I mean, I had a quick look at it a few days ago, as you know, and today I was just filming I spent an hour writing a piece and with Discover, which is a tiny, tiny library. It's 200 and something megabytes, and frankly, it sounds great. I forgot within 10 minutes that I was working with Discover. I honestly did, and you just focus on the composition, and if people can do that without having to spend hundreds or thousands of pounds, that's absolutely amazing.
Good. I'm glad that you found it. You understood what it was there for, and it works. It's really important to me. Obviously as well as Spitfire, but it's really important to me that it's understood from that point of view, and the quality of it shines through. Really.
Yeah, I mean, it really, really, really does. And for people like our postgraduate students, Core will offer a really good way in, because for the money you're getting a complete orchestra with really detailed articulations, great sound, the legendary Jake Saxon mixing, and all the rest of it. What I love about it is it's little things like, I've got an 8-year-old son, and he's come in the studio, and we've made a few songs and in GarageBand, and I've recently added a template, but also just added a plug-in of it in GarageBand, and I handed it over to him and just said, make some music, and I've got a tiny little keyboard in here, because I don't compose music, but I've got a little kind of M Audio little one of those little tiddly little things that I can but it's great because it just means I can just play stuff if I want to, but he gives him a way of playing some sounds, and he can hop up and down. He understands hopping up and down the octave and that, but I just gave him the GarageBand template, and it has all the instruments on it, and he just chose like 4 or 5 at random. I think he may have chosen a Celeste, a flute, a double bass, because he started learning that just before the lockdown, and maybe a bit of like kind of glockenspiel or something like that, and he just loved it. Played a piece and flicked through the different sounds. He would listen to them, and to have that all in one place and sound like that is great, and hopefully schools will pick up on it, and it can be a real learning tool. Yeah, and if you mix it up with the labs stuff as well, so you get sort of a piano and you get some weird and wacky stuff, you could come up with something really, really great. Yeah,
absolutely, and it's a quality thing, and to be able to the whole kind of mode switching, I think they're calling it, is something that was discussed right at the beginning too, and it really it's really strong, and it's a great that you could do it on your laptop and do it, and I'd love there to be a version that you could do on iOS, but I guess that might be a little bit too much work, really.
Yeah, that's it's only now which they're starting to get to grips with things like score writing on iPads and stuff like that. So the iOS stuff is quite a way behind of it, and then Android is even worse because they're all the different phones and devices and all the rest of it. But look, we've got PCs and Macs, and it all works great, and it means that when I do a demo or something like the thing with Discover, I can post the demo and people will be able to load the whole thing up at home.
I mean, it's great. It's great for me. I can, people can. I did the piece, for example, the piece in the trailer music is a bit of Sanson that Christian programmed, and he just sent me the file, and I could open it up, and I kept it in Discover, but obviously I could scale it up to Core or Pro, but do that. But we can share. I can share this mix template with just by doing a little mix with all the Logic stuff. Like just Logic plugins, and we can do. It opens up so much like learning and tips that people can just unravel what I've done. So it kind of takes the mystique out of it, which I guess is useful for some. What's
really interesting is over the course of the last 10 years in particular, the bar in terms of the cost of entry has been falling. I remember when I was first earning a living doing this a long time ago, you had to spend probably 10, 15, 20,000 pounds to get enough kit to be able to produce a broadcastable piece of music. and arguably now you could do it for under a couple of hundred. I mean, you could just about manage it with. You could certainly do it with Labs and some Discover, and if you're using a core, you're really in the game for under £1,000 with hardware as well. So I mean, that's no longer the barrier to entry. It puts all the emphasis on the composer to come up with something original.
Yeah, and I hope it unlocks orchestral music and people recording more, and but also like new styles of music, because it's suddenly you're going to get crossovers, which is interesting, and how people can look at that plugin. I think a lot of people who have applied have never used so far haven't used orchestral music before, and so it opens up collaborations, which is great with single musicians or whatever. It becomes endless, which is great.
Yeah. No. It's absolutely wonderful, and no, I'm a big fan. And I've had Spitfire stuff since the bespoke stuff, right back in the day. Those chamber sings, and but right then they were kind of wow. It's kept on coming. So it's really, really good, and we're enjoying it, and we think this latest endeavour opens up so many more possibilities. The full Pro version has got the most enormous number of microphones. How important are these spill microphones to the overall sound?
I think that comes. I'll answer your question in two form. There's a lot of microphones because we wanted to make this. We knew from the beginning this was going to be like it was going to get tiny and it was going to get massive, and so the only way to make sure it was massive was to do that. So there are a lot of microphones, but it was done in a way that you could have a single instrument and use it in any way you wanted. If you wanted to have a flute but use it in a kind of pop star sound, then you could do that, because you could go, for example, use the woodwind pair as some ambience. You've got a spot mic that's that, or you've got then the room, and you've got the outriggers. We've got all the Dolby Atmos mics. It was a case of putting up an extra 4 mics for that, so that gives you an extra kind of more. It looks like a lot, but it suddenly means you can use multiple outputs from the plugin and have a 5.1 or a 10 point,
okay.
7.1.
So clear this up for me. Which is the center mic? Is mono the center mic on the Decca Tree?
No, the mono mic is it's the microphone you see on the packaging, which is that kind of old BBC style microphone.
Right.
So it's like a 1930s ribbon that was behind the conductor, so it's just a very stylized mono mic.
So do you have all three of the Decca Tree mics in the mic configuration?
Yes, they're bounced to stereo.
Okay.
That's one of the boringness of that, but everything's in stereo from that point of view. But I don't think you lose too much from that, really.
You don't.
You can always,
the vast majority of people, I don't know anybody who's working in surround with samples who doesn't effectively do 4.0. I mean, because people.
I have to say, when I'm doing a 5.1 mix, there's very little that goes from an orchestra in the center channel anyway. It's just because for media that is the space for everything else, so you don't really fill it up. So that's that. So there are lots of mics, and there are, but there's it's kind of. That's what I would use if I was covering all the bases, and that's what I did. And there's things like the balcony mics, which are as far away as possible, which are nice and may not get used, but they're just there just for that one time you need them. But there are plenty of mics that you will need. There is the tree, there's the outriggers, there's the ambience, there's the close, there's the pairs if you're using winds and brass, because you really need them to not, particularly if you're going for like a modern sound, where you want that. You don't want too much distance on the sound. You want the distance, but you need the clarity. So you use, so the tree is too far away to give you the edge, but the pair gives you that kind of ambient, but not too close. You've got the real close from that. So,
but you get a very different sound from a close mic on a woodwind than you do on a stereo pair or the Decca Tree. It's sort of something. Because a woodwind section is really interesting because it is the most diverse section of the orchestra. You got where the actual sound coming out of it is so different from one instrument to another, which works on the Decca and on the stereo. But if you're just using the close mics, it can sound really disparate.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So you've got there's like about I think I used about 6 mics in the mix of various balance. The spill mics are, I think, that comes down to personal preference really, and I think if you're using 1 or 2 instruments, then they might be nice to fill in the gaps. But there was all done so that when you had the first violins, it was only the first violin mics. Right. And if you were doing an overdub, and often as we do, you would record the whole section. So I think certainly the section spill mics could be very useful, and that comes down to, again, like your preference of really how orchestral you want it to sound. If you're doing a pop thing, you wouldn't want that, but if you want doing a real orchestral thing, then I think it might be very useful.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we should clarify your involvement with this. You've been recording, mixing the whole thing right the way through the whole project.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just a bit of background for those who don't know me. I've worked out of Air Studios for 22 years. So I'm mainly working on film, TV, and computer game scores, recording, mixing, and I got involved with Spitfire at the very beginning. I didn't record the very first library, but I was a tape op, and then I took over from that point onwards, and I've recorded with them because I knew Christian and Paul for working with them and things for I've known them for 20 years, and I've got relationships with Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard and big composers. So it was nice that they could use my name and they knew me to then to help them as a kind of face of an engineering side of things for Spitfire. And sorry. I'm just trying to think what I was going to. No, so I record pretty much everything that goes through the hall air. So apart from the Hans Zimmer stuff, I've done all the Albions, all of the symphonic range, all of the solos, and that, and all the kind of all the swarms and all that kind of stuff. And then we got talking about the BBC thing, and absolutely, we went down there about maybe 4 months before we did recording, and we recce'd the place and worked out how we were going to do it, because we wanted to do it to our kind of 96k standard and have and then we were kind of feeling good about it, and then suddenly Paul talked about doing the spill mics, which then meant we had to then suddenly have 80 microphones set up all the time.
Oh my god!
So that was fine. So we had to set up our own control room, which was fine because we didn't need much, because it was we needed a way of communicating with the musicians. We needed to give them a click track, tuning notes and things like that, and then a way of. So we basically had 10 8-wide mic pre's in the live area that were then just loomed into the control room, straight into the Pro Tools. And I had a little S3 controller for a little doing balances on, and we had a little kind of remote thing that set up, and it worked well. The trouble was that it's a working studio, so. And the orchestra were busy, so even though we were recording during their kind of like downtime, we still had rehearsals, and so we'd have to, for health and safety, we had to tidy up everything between. If they had a rehearsal the next day, we had to tidy everything up and put it back out again, because the BBC is health and safety,
I know. I worked there. Like, I worked at the BBC for a long time, so I know exactly, risk assessment and all this kind of that. I just can't imagine. But tell me, I mean, musicians find it quite hard to do sampling. I mean, obviously, because what you're asking them to do when they're used to playing phrases of music and they're literally just playing a single note over and over again. How did the BBC Symphony Orchestra adapt to that?
That was really interesting, actually. It was we have myself and Harry and Stan, who are the kind of two producers from Spitfire. We have a routine that we use, and we try very hard to make it as musical as possible, even though, like you say, you're only playing single instruments. And we try and make the musicians as comfortable as possible, and to try and make it as a performance as possible. And so what we end up trying to do is let them. When it's one single person, it's quite easy to let them kind of produce themselves, because they know what their instrument sounds like and how best to make a note. And so we tell them, we're very specific about what articulation we're doing. and then we kind of leave them to it, and we would come back. We make notes we might want to get again if it's not quite the perfect start or there's a noise in it. But then it comes down to them, and they start off, I think, with some trepidation, but actually they realise that it's apart from being physically hard, which is I think is the hardest part of it, because they're having to hold their instruments up for 3 hours or or an hour and a half. They actually really like it by the end, particularly. The string players often say how much they like it because it's a very, very good practice regime, and they also like to take away the recording charts to give to their students because it's like for the legato things they like to do that because it's it's perfect way of getting that perfect interval every time, and so they actually really like it. It's just steady, get the bow and get the thing, and the woodwind players and some of the, I mean, you really understand the quality of the musicians when you see them like that, and you can certainly see some of the players, attack it as if they want to perform, 8 staccatissimo going up a whole tone scale the entire way through. And when they nail it, they're very proud of themselves. When they don't go, do we need another one? No, it's perfect. It's like great.
They do know, don't they? I mean, musicians do know, and I expect they quite quickly adapt to what you're looking for and all that kind of thing.
They do. They're used to. I mean, symphonically, they're a bit different, and the sound was quite different, particularly from the string section. Having people who sit next to each other regularly is different to like the kind of more pickup orchestras we use for the other things, because they sit next to each other all day, every day, and they know the sound and they know the blend. So it was quite interesting to hear that difference.
Right. I gather that the fan on my machine is causing problems, so I'm muting myself when I'm not speaking. Couple of questions rolling in. Are there any particular monitors which you're particularly fond of for mixing orchestral music? I mean, either in the studio or at home or both?
I have, for those who can see the surround speakers, I've got some little Genelecs, but I've got some bigger Genelecs at the front. So 8240 is a Genelecs I've had for years. I've had these for about 10 years. And they work really well for me because I know them. And so I think to answer that question is you get a set of speakers that you know and you like, and then you listen to lots and lots of music on them. And then you listen to music you like and music you don't like and listen to it and go, okay, I like the sound of that. And then, come up with almost like an aggregate of what you like of those, and then make yours sound like that. I don't think I can necessarily recommend certain speakers because everyone has different tastes and different price brackets and things like that. But my advice is just to listen to go into a shop or listen to ones you like, and then, and ones you can afford, and then just listen to lots of different things and different genres, and listen to things that are very good, mixed by people you like, or things that are made quite a lot of listens, and then that's what it should end up sounding like. So if it comes out of yours sounding like a similar way than the track you're listening to does, then you must be onto a win.
I'm a big fan also. I mean, those of you who've seen the shed know it's glass on 2 walls, 2 sides, which is not exactly acoustically perfect, but I do check on open back headphones, and I remember you telling me when you were first mixing at home you were using Sennheiser 650s and things like that. I've got some on now.
Hey,
there you go. So is that a way through for people who, because even, I mean, I've got 8020s here, or I think 8020s or 30s anyway, but I mean, they're quite expensive nonetheless. So for people who are starting out but want a decent mix, are decent headphones probably the best available way?
Open back headphones are great, but I would always try and recommend putting on some speakers as well, because there is a difference. And I always have the two. These are not Sennheisers, I will say. These are Shure ones. They're dearer than the Sennheisers, but they are fantastic. And when I listened to the two, I was like, I was astounded by these. They're lovely. I think they're 1640s or something like that. But but I do like to listen to the two. But I can find a balance ever so slightly different. But I end up trusting the speakers and headphones. But open back headphones, I would say, are an excellent starting point as well. If you're in a bedroom or something like that, then you can get some excellent results on some open back headphones. The Sennheiser HD600s are like 250 quid or something, and they are an excellent investment for sure.
So does Jake Jackson then ever get mistaken for John Powell? You could be brothers.
That's not the first time that's been asked. And yes, it has been not mistaken, but it has been asked. And I did. I think I got a photo with him last time I worked with him, and the two of us together. It was quite amusing. We did look quite similar.
So, okay, talk us through. I mean, I've always been struck with. John Powell's process. He's also a great guy for giving back. I mean, his YouTube channel, and anybody who hasn't subscribed to his YouTube channel, just go and do it as soon as this live stream is over, because he puts up. He's put up scores. He puts up his Cubase projects, the whole thing, so you can see the whole thing. But when you're working on a really enormous project like a John Powell score, which is so hybrid, does it actually change the way in which the orchestra is recorded? I mean, out of all recognition compared to how you would if they were all in the room?
I've worked with John Powell for years. I saw something. I think it may have been Ants, the first film I worked with him, or something like that. So it was like very near the beginning of my time, and I've always liked him. I loved his music, and he's a really, really, really nice guy. No, it doesn't change that much. I mean, sometimes we do bits all together. Like I did a couple of days' work covering Sean Murphy on Solo on Star Wars, and that was incredible because that was like a very traditional Hollywood film score where we recorded a lot together. But we did also do splits, and that's the thing. So you throw up a few extra mics for when you do the split sections, but it is treated for someone like John Powell, who I think is a very kind of, he's hybrid, but the orchestra is still very much an orchestral part of an orchestra rather than a kind of string and brass section. Some other composers will go slightly more kind of poppy, I guess, in their sound and that kind of stuff. And I've done computer games where you're doing, I did one for Sony called Blood and Truth, which is a VR game where you really do play around with the layout of the orchestra to get a kind of different thing, where we had 6 horns on one side and 6 horns on the other, and the brass all down the middle, and it gave it a very different. That makes it a little bit more unrecognisable. But we certainly still record it in a similar way because that's how you're used to hearing an orchestra. It might be a slightly tighter sound, but it's not dissimilar. It certainly comes from the same beginnings.
I was talking to a guy who orchestrates for not Harry Gross. Anyway, somebody who does a lot of split sessions, and he was saying one of the problems is that when you do the split sessions where you just have, for example, strings doing short notes or long notes or whatever, that they lose all sense of dynamic and everything tends to come out very mezzo forte unless you're really careful. That
does happen a lot, and there's certainly like library recordings a lot like that where you get down, you really split things down, and computer games do as well. And you do have to be very careful that the musicians, you have to, like you say, they do definitely, the dynamics kind of do that. What works great is when you record, if you've got the budget, you have all the orchestra together, you rehearse it, and then you stripe it straight away afterwards, which is fantastic. And all the top composers, if they have the budget, will do it that way because it really does. And if you've got some really tricky sections, then it might end up going, right, okay, let's pick that up tomorrow. Some of the bits of some of the really tricky string stuff is done separately, but you do have to be careful. But it's just, but the style of music, once you get into that, if you want the shorts and longs separate, then the style of music is a little bit more kind of, it's not so dynamic anyway often because it's fighting against electronics and stuff like that. So it does kind of, it's funny, isn't it? It kind of works that way and it kind of works its way out. So it does it in that certain way.
Yeah. I understand completely. Let's sort of refocus on the world in which I think the majority of our friends here with us this evening are, and that's the sampled orchestration.
Definitely. Please.
So when you're mixing, I mean, the interesting thing is, of course, you mix all the Spitfire demos as well, as far as
Yes.
I'm led to believe. So
not all of them, but the big ones.
okay.
So to speak, yeah.
I mean, the thing which has struck me with mixing sample orchestration compared to a live orchestra is a live orchestra, they're all listening to each other, and so there is a natural dynamic balance in the room, and so in many respects it's a great deal easier. Whereas when you're mixing samples, you are the one who's got to listen. So do you find mixing samples a great deal harder, and how do you overcome that problem?
Yes, it is a great deal harder, because when I'm recording an orchestra, if it's recorded well, then there's actually not much mixing to do. It's a balance of a few key microphones and then just a few rides here and there. So actually it's quite simple. But when you get down to a sample orchestra, you are, let's take BBC out of the equation because that's unique, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But if you, like, say for example, I'm just going to talk about Spitfire, and apologies to other people who don't know Spitfire or use other things, but it's just easier for me to talk about that. So if you, let's say I take something that's been done with symphonic strings, chamber strings, and the brass, symphonic brass or winds and stuff, even though they're recorded in recorded the same way, the balance out of the box isn't the same. But also, so you have that automatically. You've got the balance that's not quite the same. You have the fact is that when you're sampling, unless you've got several terabytes of data, you can't record every single dynamic, and so you've got that, and you haven't got all the round robins, and they aren't playing the notes that are written. So certain notes jump out, and that's the thing that I spot when I'm listening to music that it samples, is those short notes that have got the slightly, like, just maybe one velocity too much, that they suddenly stick out and they sound so unnatural. And I spend a lot of time going through and just turning down those notes that stick out so that it sounds like it's played for real. So I'd recommend that people do that. If they hear those notes that stick out, just pull those down, because you really hear that. But also, you don't have everything as one recording. You have it as 30 or 40 or 20 different stems. And so yes, I mean so it's a bit more balance required. I end up doing, and I recommend this to people, is not, anything that I've recorded doesn't need much EQ doing to it. So, don't spend hours and hours EQing it. Spend more time balancing it and getting the levels of reverb right, because noise reduction takes some of the reverb away and that kind of stuff. And and varying different mic positions and make different, you might need to add some reverb to make it sound a bit more, gel and everything like that. So it's more balanced than anything else. And then just sorting out the long notes so they sound like they've got natural fades on them, and those pesky notes that stick out, piano notes that have got that too loud. Or
are you mainly bouncing? I mean, you're mainly bouncing all the samples to audio so that you can then use sort of clip gain and things like that, rather than working with MIDI.
Depends what I'm doing. If people are sending it to me, then obviously I need it in audio. If with the BBC, it means I don't need that audio, and I can go through and do that. Occasionally you have problems with the occasional round robin, and that's sometimes a good time to then make it audio, so that, because you may get one round robin that's striking a bit loud, and you hear that one. So then it's quite useful to have that as audio, so you're not having to hear the same moving, so you're not chasing that round robin that comes in random places every time. So that's why it's quite useful. Yeah, that's that.
I also find it's much easier to tighten up the timing when you can see where the transient is and things, because with the greatest will in the world, even the best sample libraries are going to it's quite hard to get them to feel as though timing wise that they're all in the same room, and it's much easier when you can actually see it in a Pro Tools session or Cubase or Logic. Well,
the issue you of course have is that if you're recording a whole orchestra, then the natural delay you might get from the brass by them being further away isn't an issue. But if you're just doing a brass thing, then you want them to be on tight and on the click. So it always changes. It's always you're always using the samples in a different way. So sometimes it's just for mock-ups and therefore it's not so important. But then sometimes it's the final thing and it needs to be really tight, or sometimes it needs to be a bit loose. So yes, you're absolutely right. Having it as audio is much easier for that. So I tend to I tend to put most things orchestral as audio. Yeah.
And how much EQ and compression do you think people should need to do to sampled orchestration, given that you've already mixed it and in many respects it sounds as the orchestra sounded in the room? So should we need to be applying extra layers of EQ and compression, or should it just sound great out the box?
I think personally it sounds pretty good out of the box, but I would say that. But then also, when I mix it, I do definitely do that. I mean, I have a few things I do. I tend to roll off a bit of the kind of 3K area on violins, because I think that makes them sound a little bit more real. Particularly if you have a chord or more than one thing playing, it's suddenly just that extra brightness is just a tiny bit too brittle in my ears. So I often just tool that. But we're only talking 2 dB or something like that, and I tend to then bump up the top end from like kind of 10K up a little bit just to negate that. But anything I'm doing, I might roll off some of the bottom end so that it's not like the proper bottom end, like kind of from about like 60 hertz, if I'm using a lot of samples, so that you're not hearing a lot of that kind of rumble, but leave it on things like the basses, but take it off violins. But I will not, if any EQ I do on a traditional like sample library of that, is only be 2 curves probably and a maximum of 2 dB, and that's it. So no. And then compression comes down to then the style of music you're doing, really. Again, not much. I think if people are struggling with mixing, then they should. I often find that people are trying to do too much with it and think they have to do a lot, when actually they really don't have to do a lot, and it's just down to balance and use a balance that sounds natural. Listen to orchestral music and listen to the balance of orchestral music, and that is the balance. And if you use that balance, then it shouldn't need much mixing. I think the beauty of Spitfire, which was the main headache of sorry, not Spitfire, the main beauty of the disc of BBC SO, is that what we did for that was, from the very beginning, we knew it was going to be one library, and so we got all the musicians to agree on their dynamics, and we had one set of levels that lasted the entire time. Obviously it was more difficult we didn't start with the loudest, so I had to kind of guess, and we ended up occasionally changing it, but then we had an amazing spreadsheet that worked out what I needed to do for each mix to then balance it up. So we all started at at the mix, I clip gained the clips so that every single audio file was the same level as it is throughout the entire sample, like the entire sample library, which took several days to get that to that stage. But it had then every mix, I could flick between every mix and knew that it worked. Do you know what I mean? So the levels are, that's why BBC works so well, is because everything is relative dynamics. So the violins, when they play forte, I play forte, and you at that level. If you have my mix at 0, then that is the violins playing at forte, or whatever. And that's what I mean. And the brass, when they do that, is the same. So it should balance, hopefully, with everything faders in a line. A question we get quite a lot. And I should say we're looking at the chat going through. So if you've got questions for Jake, then please fire away, and I will put them to him straight away. We'll do a quick fire one in a bit. It's good to talk in some detail.
Reverb is a question which crops up all the time.
Yes.
And whether you use sort of 1 layer of reverb or 2, or finishing reverb. What is your current approach? I know are you still Altiverb man? Are you?
Yep. I for those that look at my videos with Christian Henson, we talk a lot about video reverb, and we do have another one in the pipeline. But it's I tend to use 2 reverbs. I like the idea of using 2 to combine 2. I think it just makes it sound less like a real reverb and more like a more hall, because you get, if you use 2 different styles, they counteract each other, and they end up being something that I think sounds very natural. So I use an Altiverb Worcester Hall, which was in Altiverb 6, the large hall 1 preset. It works great. And I also got an exponential audio, which is now owned by Isotope, but I use that as my other secondary main reverb, and use 2 halls together, and I think it works well. And for samples, I don't put too much on, but just enough on everything, just to make those tails work, and to not smudge it up, but just give it a little bit. So if talking at like kind of I guess kind of -20 on a send or something like that. Really, is where I start.
I would imagine now, because BBC Symphony Orchestra is obviously more of a soundstage in ambience rather than the hall, that actually gives you more room for that, because with the original symphonic libraries, they were obviously quite, the ambience of air means there's not much room to add extra reverb without it getting too drenched. So actually, now you've got a drier sound to start with, you can start playing around a little bit more with the reverb.
But you're absolutely right, but the room sound at the Maida Vale works very nicely, so it's a kind of nice combination. But I think you always need a little bit of reverb in there just to help you, just take your ear away from the sampleness of it sometimes.
There's a techie question about MidSide EQ and things like that. Is that something you use?
I do. I use it at the end of the mix. I'll use it on a kind of stereo mix to help give it a little bit of extra width sometimes. But occasionally I'll use it on a mix if I've got a quite a monophonic synth, but I want to make that sound a bit more interesting. So I'll definitely use a bit of side on that for that. Yes, but it's kind of, I use it sparingly.
I mean, one of the advantages of using just one library is you have one ambience to contend with. I mean, that when you are using a template which consists of different libraries recorded in different places, you're sort of superimposing different ambiences together, and that can be very, very confusing. So particularly in surround, actually, as soon as you actually start using real surrounds in the back, you've got these weird 3D spaces that sort of stacked up on top of each other, and it really, what kind of nightmare am I now in? It's kind of, oh Lord.
Yeah, it is. You do hear that much more, because you suddenly, like, you're in different rooms, different perspectives and everything. But like with all the Spitfire libraries that we've done at Air, we start with the same setup, so that they are interchangeable to a certain degree. I make sure that the brass are in their brass position, put the harp in the harp position, I put the percussion in the percussion position, so that you're getting that distance from the tree. But you can use the mid mics as a great way of being able to bring yourself closer to that. And that's something that, as libraries get better and technology improves, and as long as people don't mind having the extra mic positions, that's where it becomes really helpful. Is those mid positions are really useful for if you don't want too much room on something, but you can then use the mid, and that's something that we've worked on to get better, to give people more options.
Kyle McCatty wants to know whether you use any particular mastering software.
I don't master that much, really. I like to try and give people that extra. But like if they want me to mix it, I am a mix engineer, and I know very good mastering engineers. So I try not to do both things, because I think it's a good process to have somebody else to master it, because then you're getting another kind of idea on it, and it means I'd have to worry less about making sure that I've got everything at the right. In fact, people often, when people ask me to mix things, they ask me to mix things relatively quickly, and I want to make sure that I'm mixing things in the best to make the best sound, and not necessarily about where it's got to fit into. So I make them in terms of, best way of explaining that, I want to spend more time mixing and less time worrying about relative levels to a certain degree. So I make sure that I make sure that it sounds good and it hits the right level, but I don't then worry about how one track's going to play into the next, unless I'm asked specifically to do that. That's a mastering and engineer's job. But I will, of course, master some things for some people, and if I'm delivering something to somebody and I know it's going to go to an exec who needs to hear it, then I will use stuff. And I would happily recommend any of the FabFilter plugins as a great starting point for relatively cheap plugins. The EQ, I think, is spectacular. I use it all the time. It's got everything you need. It's got the mid and side. It's got the dynamic EQ, and it's just got the fact that you can have you can have as many nodes as you like, and the fact you can see the waveform, which you shouldn't ever mix by looking at it, but it does help you find those naughty frequencies sometimes, particularly when you're mixing things that people are giving you. It's really useful. But I use the limiter on that. Anyway, to answer that question, the limiters on that is excellent.
I love the fact that Sockfoot has just invented a new AAA film composer called John Pyle, Pyle, who's right up there with his latest score for Hatch. No, it's John Powell. John Powell. Sorry, it was my enunciation, I'm sure, or the ones. Yeah. Oh no! I was about to say something very rude about John Piles, but we won't go down that route in any way, shape, or form. A number of people have asked this actually. Charles Gaskell brings it up. What happens if you want? It's about really pre-panning and the fact that where you place the instruments in the room.
Yes.
And what happens if you want sort of non-traditional seating arrangements where you might have basses left and right or that kind of thing? How does that work?
Great question. So I would do this a number of ways. If I'm going to talk about Logic because I think that's what most people are certainly going to do that. First of all, in Logic, make sure if you're using pan, you're using the stereo pan tool, not the balance pan, which is what it is naturally sets to. So just Command click on your pan pot and you'll understand the difference. You'll see there. I'll just explain briefly what the difference is. A stereo pan moves the both sides of the signal, the left and right, to the position you're aiming at. The balance one that comes with Logic will turn the left-hand side down and the right-hand side up if you're panning to the right. If you're panning to the left, so basically it removes the right-hand side. If you're panning left, it will remove the right-hand side of the signal, which is so that if you've got a violin that was recorded on the left and you pan it to the right, we're using the out-of-the-box Logic, you then lose all of the left-hand side signal. So that is obviously silly. So use the stereo panner. But what I would do if you want like second violins on the right and first violins on the left, then I would either duplicate the first violin track and flip in the utility gain. You can flip left and right, and then you've got all of the microphone settings, but just reversed. So you could do that with second violins, for example. If you just take your plugin and use the use a plugin that flips left and right over, or just pan it back to front, depending on which software you're using. Then suddenly you've got all the mic positions flipped the other way around, which is really useful. So you could put the basses, if you wanted the basses on the left and the right, you just literally flip the whole signal path. It takes a little while for your brain to work it out, but it then means that everything is then in the right place. The room is the right way around. The outriggers are the right way around. The spots the places the right way around, which is really handy way of doing it. I think I don't tend to use the panning mode inside of the GUI that much inside of the sample library because I tend to have audio. So if I want to do it, I will then, if someone gives me an audio track, I'll either flip it like the same way. I use Pro Tools, so I'll just cross pan left and right. Or if I want to move like the violas over to the other side, then I'll just pan it a bit and do it that way. So it's in audio you can pan it, and then I think with samples you can use the pan mode inside of the software, or you can use the pan mode inside the sample player. What I will say is what's great about the BBC SO library is that we've recorded each instrument with this another stereo pair, which is called, I think it's just called stereo pair. I can't remember off the top of my head, but look it up. But that is purely for like a kind of close-up sound that is not positioned in any space apart from just down the middle, which is a very useful way of getting a sound if you want it to like have a relatively close sound with a flute, for example, or a trombone, and it's a spot mic. It's a bit more than a spot mic, but essentially it's a spot mic that you can pan really nicely and you get a nice sound.
Excellent. There's a interesting question from Mr. Drummer 316. Jake, do you bring solo instruments into the middle slightly or leave them in their sections?
It really depends. If it's I've just been mixing something now that's was recorded, but by real instruments, but it has like 8 or 10 different violin and string parts. I think it depends. If it's a solo flute, for example, in the midst of an orchestra, then I'll have it in the middle certainly, or maybe a tiny bit to the left, depending on what it's for. If it's an albums track, or if it's if it's got to fit around some dialogue. But yes, but if it's like 5 or 6 different instruments, then I'll pan them around to give ear something to not all down the middle, because I think that certainly makes it it makes the mix harder to balance. If you can spread it out and it still sounds good, then that's, I think you can spread it out is a better way of doing it. And I think it's important to remember that with all mixing is that there aren't necessarily that many rules. It's what sounds good, and if it sounds good to you, then it's important that you do that. Stick with it.
So in general, the Spitfire libraries are pre-panned with the sections in the correct place, except for the close mics presumably are brought in slightly.
No, I think the close mics out of the box are where they would be, because the idea is that if you play a multi that's got you got everything as it would be, but you can pan them. There is a way of panning them. Yeah.
I'm a big fan of but the controllers are always pre-assigned. Is it 22, 23, 24 or whatever to close, tree and ambient? So I have it set on a 3 faders in front of me, so I can always just just like I've got the mix in real mixer when I'm using just the Spitfire stuff, so I can just bring up a mix straight away. It's really, really useful.
Yeah. In the BBC SO, there are 2 close signals. There's one that is panned and there's one that's not panned. So you can then use that as well to pan it yourself.
Just having a quick look through it here. So there was just looking for some extra questions. Oh, any tips on mixing guitar and bass guitar?
Yeah, sure. I assume we're talking acoustic guitar, maybe, or maybe not. Acoustic guitar. Again, it's mixing. If you can get it well recorded, then that's important. Dynamic, as great sound with the instrument as you can. So listen to where the microphone is positioned. If you're recording an acoustic guitar, get on your hands and knees. Get your performer to play it. Put your head where about foot and a half away from where the guitar is, and move your ear around and just listen to where it sounds the sweetest. Remember where that position is. Put a mic there, and that's a great starting point for getting an acoustic guitar sound. If you've got a mono guitar sound, then just do that. If you can then take a bit of room with it, then great. Amps, get a close-up mic, but then also get a room mic as well if you can with an amp. It's a really nice way of just adding a bit of space and a bit of into that. Bass guitar, again, if it's acoustic bass, again, similar treatment, not too close but not too far away, and then listen to where it sounds sweet. Each bass is different, whether it's like a jazz bass or if it's an orchestral bass, and if you're doing a jazz bass, then you want it slightly closer, I think, and you might want it to have it nearer the bridge so you get a bit more of a slappy sound, and maybe coming down a bit higher, so you get a bit of finger noise and that kind of stuff. But it's if you can use it, get the sound you want at the recording stage, and it makes the mix a lot easier. So that's definitely the kind of cheat answer to that question. And then it's just about again, don't over EQ these things unless if they've been recorded well, you don't need to over EQ anything really. And then just get a balance. It's about the balance, and I always think guitars sound a little bit better if they're not coming down the face, down the middle. So I think just pan them off to one side if you can a little bit, maybe 15 degrees, something like that. I think it works really nicely. Bass, because it gives if you have the guitar off one side and the bass down the middle, and if they've got a piano, for example, you've got that trio, you've got the interest on the piano maybe on the right hand, the melodic side, you've got the acoustic guitar slightly left, and you've got the bass down the middle, and it's a real nice kind of like blend of a great starting point for a trio like that.
Very good. Let me just say that I know there's a couple of questions about people asking if Spitfire are going to do this or Spitfire are going to do that, and I completely understand why you're asking. Jake is not in a position to tell you anything which is going to happen in Spitfire in the future. So I can just tell you that. So there's no point in asking.
A lot of it I don't know because I only know what I'm involved in, and I'm not a member of staff. I am a freelance. I am employed by them, and I know Christian and Paul socially, but I can't talk about Spitfire. Only things that are out there I can talk about, and I'm very happy to talk about. They're very happy to talk about it too. So
excellent.
So yeah.
Okay.
Ask posthumous questions.
Posthumous questions. As a freelance, there is a question coming up for people who are interested in getting into sort of your line of work. Because how does that work? How do you actually break into being a an engineer and a mixer?
I mean, I can give you my journey, and then I'll tell you a more modern journey, because I'm 44 next month. I'm a bit of an old git now. But hopefully I can escape lockdown for my birthday. But I very much came the traditional route. But I also had some things on my. I made my luck, and but I also had a few, a few lucky moments along the way. My dad is a musician, a rock musician. So I brought up with his hip and his Tascam 4-track in the loft. So I knew a little bit about it. I then did a music technology degree. And then I started working with a small studio. And so I got some experience. And then my CV went to near the top of the pile of air, which was helpful. That was the first kind of big bit of luck. And the thing that was kind of outside of my control, because I knew somebody who could get my CV nearest the top. But that certainly didn't. I was not given an interview because my CV was given to them. I got an interview because my CV looked good and I was interesting. So I had an interview, and that went okay. Not brilliant, and I didn't get the job. I wasn't the person who didn't get the job. But I got a call about 3 weeks later saying that the person who had been given the job didn't want the job anymore, and I was the next person on the list, and so therefore, would you like to come and start working for the princely sum of about £7,000 a year back then? And of course I jumped at the chance, and then from there on, then it became like that was one bit of luck, is that the other bit of luck is that the person didn't want to do the job, and then I made the job mine by turning a 35-hour week into often a 100-hour week, back onto another 100-hour week, back onto an 80-hour week, back to onto a 90-hour week, just having the time of my life doing that and working hard. And then to get to where I am now, it was then a question of just working hard, listening to everybody, absorbing everything I could, the great ways, the great engineers, how they did things, how they did things I liked and how things I didn't like. The great engineers, like doing things. The great engineers started to put their trust in you to do things for them and not screwing that up. Go a mix, like be there at the end of the night or get in first thing in the morning and just solo a few things and listen and pop the EQ in and out and things like that. Like nothing that could get you into trouble for screwing it up, but just to have a listen to what they did. And doing like recall sheets is really interesting to see what people did. Like poring over a desk, and actually the most back-breaking thing I'd do on a James Bond mix years and years and years ago was we were mixing on a 96-channel desk and having to do a recall of the entire 96 channels of every single dial having to be moved starting at 1 a.m. so that at 10 a.m. the next day the engineer could come in and you'd be there at 4 with a beer and going crazy. But what you'd press play on machines and you'd flick between what's coming out of the desk and what was coming back before, and if it wasn't right, you'd worked out what it was. And then when you got it right, it was such a great feeling. You'd run home, get some sleep, come back the next day, and the engineer would give you a big thumbs up, and that was it. So that was the old-fashioned way of doing it. And the new way is not dissimilar, really. You just have to make your luck. You have to listen to a lot of things. You have to, find people that you can help out. Find composers you want to collaborate with, and just experience. There is nothing that is better for you than experience. And so the fact is you can learn from people like myself now online is amazing. I couldn't do that, but take some things from me, take things from other people. There's certain things my style you may like, there's some things my style you may hate. It works for me, but you can't replicate what my ears can hear. But
talking of your ears, there's a number of questions floating about how do you protect your ears. If you're mixing day in and day out, how do you Julian Packard, huge question for Jake, how do you deal with ear fatigue? So not just protecting your ears, but also just when you've been listening to the same thing for 10 hours, can you really hear it anymore?
It's that is again experience. That's like it's like I think of it as like fitness. It's like like jogging, you know what I mean? It's like like some people I like to listen to music when I'm on my way home, just to like decompress my ears a little bit. So how do I do that? I listen at not too loud as a dynamic, and it's a kind of a naturalish kind of dynamic, I guess, if you're doing orchestral stuff, a bit below, but I have that same level all day long where I can, so that you're not giving yourself too much like peaks and troughs, so to speak. Really, I will turn it down if I want to get a balance and check it quieter, but I won't really ever turn it up really loud, because that then just destroys you for the rest of the day. So it's having a set level my ears are used to hearing, that isn't too loud, isn't too that. Have regular breaks, go for a little wander, run inside, go to the toilet, you know what I mean? Things like, I drink quite a lot of water so that I do have to go to the toilet, you know what I mean? It's a silly thing, but it's like, I don't smoke, so I don't go and have those cigarette breaks, but I do make sure that I go and have a toilet break from time to time. So I do that. But it's just training and doing that. But I will, if I've got a big mix, then I won't print it that night. I will come back and listen to it in the morning. But also, what I think is great, and why I tend to mix a lot in the box, is that you can do these where you do 3 really tough days mixing, and then you have a 4th day where you go through and listen to everything, and you can and you, if you hear it on a different day, it can sound quite different, and having that revisit is so great. So the fact you can open up sessions and open up mixes from 3 days ago, 3 weeks ago, and make a tiny tweak, and it's so fantastic. It's a great way of working. So so don't never print a mix at the end of the day unless it's the very last day of the session and you've run out of time.
There's a Sir Ulrich von Fattenberger, who is absolutely clearly his real name. I had an interesting question about the vintage cartoon style, which is actually a little bit like the Bernard Herrmann library. Was that a very different experience mixing in that? Because actually this leads on to a question on how the sound of a mix has changed over time. But when you listen to the Bernard Herrmann sound, you are slightly listening to the Scott Bradley sound, which is, how did you go about recording and mixing that? And in what ways it's radically different to the way you do it normally?
Well, I'm afraid I didn't do the Bernard Herrmann library. that was Simon Rhodes, because that was there was a stipulation by his estate that they wanted Simon to do it. So that was great. It was nice to hear that. But when I do hear it, I do totally. But that was also recorded in Air Studio One, so it's a much smaller sound. So it had that thing. But a lot of that is, as I understand the library, which I don't know particularly well, is about the combination of instruments. But then a lot of that original sound comes back down to the recording devices at the time, and that's to kind of hijack this question to answer another question, and something that's on my mind is that obviously the way we record and the way what we record onto has changed so much over the years. Like when I first started out, we recorded pretty much everything on 2-inch tape. That was within 5 years gone to 1/2-inch dash digital tape, and then that went on to computers. So I used Pro Tools for the first time properly on a session for Gladiator. So we had a two dash machines recording I think 96 channels, maybe it was 48 channels of digital, but we had a Pro Tools machine running parallel. And once we realized that was working, it was then taken and mixed from there, because you could edit at the same time and all that kind of stuff. But the way samples of libraries have changed, and I think you can even hear it in why something like the Discover works so well, is because we tried very hard to make sure the recording chain was as clean as possible and as good as possible, good microphones and that kind of stuff. And I think it's really important for recording is that, like for samples, I think it's imperative you use the best microphones you can, because the moment you start adding these things up, all those little noises and all those artifacts make a difference. Because for those who saw before we started, there was that video that I mixed that Paul Thompson wrote. And if you don't know, just go to Spitfire Library and look at their most recent video. It's a performance of the BBC Symphony Orchestra recording at home on their mobile phones, and the whole thing was recorded on mobile phones and mixed. And the sound quality is, the mix I spent a lot of time in the mix, and I'm very pleased with how it turned out. But the sound quality of those things is so terrible at the moment. It's not bad with one person, or if it's but there's so much processing goes onto it, and the moment you add it together, oh my God, it's like it's impossible to mix. And so if you think about that from sample libraries, if you haven't got a great bass recording, the moment you then layer it up, which you have to do with samples, you can't just have one microphone. If we're doing sectionals of orchestras, we may end up with four on top of each other, and you end up having four times as much noise. If you think about a sample library, you're going to have maybe 20 or 30 amounts of noise. And so it's really important. And
string harmonics are particularly prone for that, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was also, this advert I've been doing with some kids choir. I got my son to sing a couple of lines on top using a microphone here, and it was the difference of that sound was incredible. That the way it cut through, like it was like I had to have like maybe 6 of him versus about 100 other iPhone recordings, and the 6 of him sounded as big as 100 other recordings, just because of the way they were all coming out the same frequency. It was very, despite what I did to try and move it around, and it's interesting how it was fascinating for me actually, like this lockdown period, using inferior quality recordings and how much that makes the proper recordings important.
There's a number of questions about remote recording, actually. I mean, do you have a process for? I mean, because now this is becoming more and more of a thing. I mean, before this happened, this was more and more of a thing where people, you've got solo musicians all over the shop. Is there a particular process? Do you, do people record locally and then you just use Source Connect or whatever to hook up? Or people have been talking about Steinberg Connect and various other things. What's your experience of this?
I've got 2 experiences. I often, and I think this will certainly happen more now that if people can't come over, like American clients can't come over to record scores, so they've got to be quarantined for 2 weeks. Then I think it will happen more, and we do it a lot where we have a Source Connect, where we have the orchestra doing that, and or a choir, for example. That's quite common, is to do choirs over here, and the composer is there on a Source Connect and can talk back and has a stereo mix, or uses the pro version that you can send timecode to, which is great. So you can watch it with picture and do that. And the musicians are used to hearing people now with that ever so slight delay. It's not much now. It's pretty incredible what you can do with that. So that's that. I think if people are recording for you now, and if you can listen in via Skype or those things, then great, because you can direct. But they need to record it themselves. So anybody who wants to do some remote recording has to have a decent setup and to understand the DAW and understand how their instrument sounds in their particular room. So, take some advice from people about how, think about how people record you when you're in the studio, and try and bring that into your own recording space. Make sure you get a bit of room, even if it's not a particularly great sounding room, but it just gives the mix engineer some options. So it's not just one mic close up. I don't know this time, but I know I've seen people talk about that. But anything you can do to avoid any lag is great. Obviously, there cannot be a system where there is no lag, because it's just impossible for a signal to get. It's impossible for a sound signal to leave a computer without any latency. But we're getting there. It's like those Source Connect things are pretty amazing, that it can get across to several thousand miles away via several computers and only be, best part of a second behind. It's extraordinary, really.
I know. I mean, when we do our live orchestral sessions in Prague for the students, they're listening in and listening on Source Connect all over the world. And I know a lot of people work that way now. Do you frequently at AIR get people where the composer doesn't come over and just listens in via Source Connect or something like that?
Yeah, more and more. And I think, like I said, I think that will change. Certainly for the foreseeable future, that will be how we do recordings in the UK. But I'm sure there's certainly composers wouldn't mind me saying that they often do. There isn't time, particularly in this modern day where schedules are really tight, that they can't come. I mean, not for the big movies, but sometimes for overdubs, they won't be there because there just isn't the time.
No, absolutely. I mean, there was a question which flew by, which I thought was a good one, but I can't see who it was now. Which was, he can hear when something's wrong, but he just doesn't know how to fix it. And this ties into a number of questions about training and ear training and things like that. So, how do you go about learning, to hear something and go, that's just wrong. This particular frequency is wrong, or it's overcompressed, or how do you learn this stuff?
I think it's just experience, really. It's a kind of hard answer. It's hard to hear as an answer, but if the moment you hear something wrong in a mix, stop and fix it, because otherwise, I'm guilty of this myself. I often hear something and then forget, or if I think something's not right, and if I hear that something's not right, I don't go back and fix it. I get cross with myself, But a lot of certainly a lot of the basic mistakes are down to people trying to do too much to samples or recordings, so that you're artificially making the sound not real anymore by adding too much EQ or taking too much EQ away, and then that makes it sound wrong because you're not hearing what it should sound like. So my always my first thing to do is to make the sound individually sound nice. So we're not talking about thinking about it as a, and I've said this in other interviews, but videos and stuff, but I'll say it again now because I think this is how I do a mix. Is, you think about chefs, the great chefs use best ingredients, and I liken my mixing the same way. So you make each sound as great as possible, as if it's the only thing in the mix. So you make it sound nice. You don't think about the fact you've got to take out 6K because that's what someone's told you to do. You go, right, okay, this is what this sounds like. This sounds really nice. Right, next one, that sounds really nice. And then, but you make it sound nice without reverb, and then you make it sound nice with reverb, right? And then you don't overcompress it at this stage. You go, right, okay, this sounds nice. Right, it sounds nice. Right, okay, the next, you go through those, and it might take you an hour. It might take you 2 hours on a big mix, but you go through and you've got those things. And then you balance those together. And then you start tweaking compression, and then you start doing rides at that point. It's a case of get the balance right, and then I'll start EQing things a bit more. If I find that something's not cutting through enough, then I'll EQ it at that stage once I've got the balance right. And then but again, it's not much. It's then rides and things like that. So it's like, get yourself, if you can afford a little fader, great, use that, because it's something nice about doing that. And I for many years didn't have a fader, and I felt like I'm so much happier now. You can't see it, but I've got a little 8 fader Avid S1 that is
this actually ties exactly into what people have just been asking about, which is controllers specifically for use with BBC Symphony Orchestra. I mean, there's two sides to this. One is the key switches, which standardize on Spitfire starting at C-2. I use one of those. It's cheap as chips. They're about 60 quid. It's an Akai APC Mini. You can't program it, but the buttons start at C-2 and go up. So if you just don't want to be constantly going 2 octaves down or whatever to hit the key switch, you just use this. I've now got 2 in both studios, and it all works great. The fader thing is much harder though, because they're either really expensive or there's too much of them. I use a thing called an Icon Platform M+, which is just 8 faders, and they're very nice and it works great, and I can program them for any CC I want. What do you use, Jake?
Well, I can't answer that question from an inside of a plugin point of view. I need to talk about it from a mix point of view. And I use for a while I used a fader port, which I like very much, but now I've got this Avid S1, which because I use Pro Tools mainly, and it integrates with that really fantastic. I have 2 iPads, so that I've got one that's kind of got the control page, and I've got one that then has the 8 faders that line up with the 8. I can't show you because it's the wrong aspect from this thing, but I think if you look at my Instagram, there's some pictures on there. My Instagram is Jake at Air, JAKE80 AIR, and you'll see it there. And what's great about the way that works, because it's an Avid product, is that as you flick around the Pro Tools screen, it follows you. So the moment it's got 8 faders, and it's got the names on the screen, and you can just dive down and move it around. It's fantastic. But that also works in Logic too, which is great. So if I'm mixing in Logic, I've got the same thing applies. So it actually just works by just between the two. So it's not cheap because you've got to have 2 iPads to get it. to work how I like to have it, because I like to have one. I've got this side that's got the control app, so I can flick between bank around, or just have the like to see where the mix levels are. But then this one on this side, which is where my faders are, that has the waveform, that has the individual track dynamics. So it's much easier to if you're looking at that, you can see, and have to read the thing, you can see where something's playing. You can just grab that fader, which is really handy.
I should say, look, we're going to wind this up in about 5 minutes. There are some questions which have been rolling through, which are more composition questions, which would be easy for me to answer, but I'm going to rather than answer them now while we got Jake with us, I will leave them for another day, and we'll do another Q&A where we'll have composers involved, and so we'll approach it from a slightly different point of view, which I think hopefully makes sense to you. A couple of other questions. I saw an interesting question from Richard Cave, which was, how do you get, in this sort of clean and squeaky digital age, how do you get that sort of analog warmth back into a mix?
I tend not to worry about it too much, to be honest with you. I think if it's unless somebody wants it, then I might add an analog plugin, emulator plugin. But I find that with the right EQ and the right samples and the right balance, that you don't need that. You don't need that analogness. That's a preference thing, really. That's it. I'll use a tape emulator if I want a bit of analogness in there, but it's. I don't like the hiss of the fake hiss that like waves, for example, add in. It just annoys me. So I switch all those noises off.
Oh, I know, and they're really noisy. The H delay analog thing, and you think, I don't need that little button, because if you've got 3 or 4 delays going, on a sound designery type thing, and it's all getting. You think, sounds almost as bad as the fan inside my MacBook. Oh my goodness gracious me. There was another really good question which I was going to pick up on actually as it whizzed through. What's the when you hear other people's mixes, people who starting out mixing, are there any kind of really blindingly obvious mistakes which you hear time and time again which are easy to fix?
I think if you're looking about samples, I think the things to watch out for is, like we've talked about, really, don't over EQ. Certainly, watch out for those stray pizzicato or short notes that have suddenly got a much louder, a red coloured, for example, sample that sneaks in there, because that just sounds so wrong. Think about, before you commit to a mix, listen to a bit of real music, in inverted commas, real recording, sorry, I should say, so that you can just double check how things sound, and you just catch those things that just catch your ear. It's like, if it's catching your ear, then it's not necessarily the good way. It's, what I tend to do actually is as I'm printing a mix, is pick up my phone and do something else, which is another great way of not worrying about my ear fatigue, is to switch off my ears at that point. And it's amazing what you hear when you're not listening. When you're there reading something, your brain's doing something else, then you hear the mistakes. That's when I hear the mistakes, and people often think that I'm being ignorant when I'm looking at my phone during a mix. But it's very deliberate. It's so that my brain is doing something else, and I immediately hear what's wrong with the mix in it. It might be a noise I haven't heard for an hour, or it might just be an instrument that's too loud. I'm like, how's that happened? Just because I'm not listening to it, and that's, your brain is subconsciously telling you what's wrong with it there. So that's a great tip too.
One final question, an interesting one, was how important is it to listen to classical recordings, as I said, but I mean real live orchestral recordings, so people come to know what a real live orchestra sounds like? Because I am aware
I think
there are a lot of people who've grown up particularly with hybrid orchestral recordings and things, where you're just so used to listening to the sound of samples and sound of samples blended. There are people who are forgetting what a live orchestra actually sounds like.
Absolutely, and I mean, listen to the people like John mentioned, John Powell first up. But he uses both and works. Some schools will have a lot of, be very synth sample heavy, and some won't. For example, like that solo is Han Solo, the Star Wars film is very orchestral. And I guess some of these more, some of those more other scores are a bit more hybridy from that point of view. But listen to go on Spotify or go on Apple Music or whatever it might be, and just pick a few scores at random. You don't even have to know them. Go back maybe 10, 15 years before samples became really, and just listen to the balance of an orchestral music from different genres. There's a whole mixture out there, but you'll but it's important to know how a balance should be. That I think that's when it starts sounding not real to people, is when the balance isn't right. And sometimes you might deliberately not want it to be balanced correctly. You may want a soft sample that's played really loud for an effect. But if you're going for a traditional mock-up sound, then the balance is really, really is utter key. And so listen to something you're trying to emulate. Listen to a bit of Stravinsky or a bit of Dvorak or something like that, where you've got an orchestra and you just go, that's how loud that should be, and it'll just make it'll fit.
Okay. That, I know that there are loads and loads more questions which you'd love to answer, and loads more questions which I'd like to ask, but that, I think, is all we've got time for today. Look, it's Jake, thank you so much for today. It's been absolutely wonderful. We've really I've learned a lot. I'm sure all those people all over the world, the Faroe Islands to Malaysia, I've seen a whole load of people from the most incredible.
How many people we had joining us?
We've got about 350 online at the moment. What normally happens is we will get a couple of thousand over the course of an hour. So that's a couple of thousand people who are now know more about it than they did, if that's possible, from the from the start. So look, thank you so much. That was absolutely great. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks everyone,
and we had a really good time. So look, I'm going to say goodnight to you for the time being, and we will be back with more videos later in the week. You can check out the Spitfire YouTube channel, which has got loads of really great stuff on it. Keep posted with Jake's Twitter feed, which is always entertaining and informative as well. So, thank you very much indeed.
Cheers, Guy. Thanks for having me.
Not at
if
all.
you want, Twitter's good for me. It's at Jake Jackson is my Twitter handle. So contact me that way.
Brilliant, absolutely great. Well, thank you very much indeed, and we'll do more live soon, and so we'll stay safe, everybody, keep making music, and till the next time, thank you very much indeed. Okay, cheerio, babe.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.